My name is Vera Calloway. I'm 32 years old. And the evening of my own birthday dinner was when I finally understood that some people will hand you the most complete accounting of who they are, and then expect you to keep paying the bill anyway. It happened at Sorrel, a restaurant on the north side of the city that I had reserved 6 weeks in advance, in the private dining room off the main floor, a room with 12 chairs, a long walnut table, low pendant lighting, and a window that looked out onto the street below where the November rain was coming down in steady diagonals. I had chosen the restaurant. I had arranged the reservation. I had confirmed the guest list, handled the dietary requirements, and organized the evening with the same attention I brought to everything I organized, which was considerable, and which no one at the table had ever specifically asked me about. 12 guests that evening, my parents, my brother Marcus, 3 friends of mine from different chapters of my life, 2 couples my parents had known for decades, my father's cardiologist, Dr. Anita Rourke, and my father's estate attorney, a man named Philip Gaines, who had been drafted into the evening by my mother on the grounds that my father liked him and that Philip had told her he had no other plans. I had not objected to either addition. It was my birthday, and I had learned over 32 years to absorb the ways the guest list of my own life got quietly rearranged. My father stood up between the appetizers and the main course. He was not a man given to spontaneous speeches. He was deliberate by nature, measured in his public presentation, and this, I would come to understand later, was a speech he had been carrying for some time and had decided that a dinner in my honor was the appropriate occasion to deliver it. "I want to say something," he said. He said it to the table, to all 12 of us, in the tone of a man who had decided the moment had come. "I think it's important to be honest, especially with people you love. And I've been thinking lately, with everything going on with my health, with how much I've been reflecting, that I owe everyone here the truth of what I actually feel." I watched him. I held my water glass in my right hand, and I did not set it down. "Vera has always been," he paused. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the pause of a man selecting the precise word. "She has always been the child I wasn't prepared for. The one I didn't choose, if I'm being completely honest. If I could go back and make different decisions," he looked at me then directly, the way he had looked at me at other moments in my life when he wanted to make sure I was receiving what he was transmitting. "If I could do it again, she wouldn't be in the picture." The table went quiet in the specific way that a table full of people goes quiet when something has been said that cannot be retrieved. I set my water glass down. Not quickly, not with force. I set it down in the center of its coaster with the same deliberate care I would have used if nothing had been said at all, and I looked at the pendant light above the center of the table, a warm amber globe, perfectly still, and I breathed once, slowly, through my nose. Dr. Anita Rourke, seated to my father's immediate left, placed both her hands flat on the table in front of her. She looked at them for a moment. Then she folded them together, stood, said she needed to make a quick call, excused herself with the controlled economy of a person who has spent decades in rooms where composure is a professional requirement, and walked toward the door that led to the restaurant's small lobby. What none of the 11 remaining people at that table knew, what my father did not know, what my mother did not know, what Marcus did not know, was that the medical proxy document that would formalize Dr. Rourke's role as the supervising cardiologist on my father's upcoming valve replacement procedure had been sitting and signed on her desk since Wednesday. She had told me this herself, 3 days before my birthday, when I called her office to confirm a question about the pre-procedure protocol. She had said she would sign it and return it to the hospital's intake coordinator by the end of the following week. She had not signed it yet, and she had just excused herself from my birthday dinner to make a call. I need to take you back, because what happened at Sorrel on a rainy November evening did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from a specific geography, from the particular landscape of a family that had organized itself, for as long as I could remember, around a set of unexamined assumptions about who mattered and in what order. My father, Robert Calloway, was 67 years old and had spent his working life as a civil engineer, a man who understood systems, who could read structural load and calculate tolerances, who had an instinctive respect for things that were correctly built and a corresponding impatience for things that were not. He had married my mother, Diana, when they were both 26, and Marcus had come 18 months later, planned, anticipated, welcomed into a life that was ready for him. I came 4 years after Marcus, at a point when my parents had settled into their roles and their rhythms and had, by most accounts I have assembled from peripheral sources over the years, not been planning to add to them. This is not a wound I am describing. I am describing a fact. I arrived into a family that had already found its shape, and the shape did not have a dedicated space for me. My parents were not unkind. My mother was warm in the diffuse way of women who spread their warmth evenly and therefore thinly across everyone in their vicinity. My father was present in the physical sense. He was at the dinner table, he attended the relevant events. He was not absent in the ways that fathers are sometimes absent. What he was instead was oriented elsewhere. His attention had a center of gravity that was not me, and I learned to navigate around that center of gravity the way you learn to navigate around any fixed object, by adjusting your own path rather than expecting the object to move. Marcus was the object center. This is also not a wound. It is simply an observation about the family's physics. Marcus was charismatic in the way my father was charismatic, loud in the right registers, competent in the visible ways, easy in rooms full of people who had authority. He had followed my father into engineering, taken a position at a firm in the city, and occupied, in the family narrative, the role of continuation, the evidence that my father had built something that would outlast him. I was the evidence of something else, though I could never have told you precisely what. The afterthought, the amendment, the thing that had been added to the document after the main text was already settled. I do not want to suggest that my childhood was unhappy, because it was not unhappy in any straightforward sense. I had food and shelter and education and the general infrastructure of care. What I did not have, and what I understood only in retrospect, in the way that you understand the shape of a room after you have left it, was the specific quality of being known, of being seen as a person whose particular nature was interesting to the people responsible for her. My father did not know what I was interested in. My mother knew in the general way that mothers accumulate information about their children, but not in the specific way that requires attention. Marcus did not particularly wonder about me at all, which was not cruelty. It was simply the self-absorption of a firstborn who has never been asked to make room. What I did, in response to this particular family geography, was become useful. I want to be precise about what I mean by useful because it is a word that gets used in a lot of ways. I do not mean helpful in the easy social sense, the kind of helpfulness that consists of bringing a dish to a gathering or remembering birthdays. I mean useful in the structural sense, useful in ways that were load-bearing, that held things in place that would have caused visible problems if removed. I became, beginning in my mid-20s, the person in the family who managed the complexity, the person who understood the systems. The systems, in my family's case, were primarily medical. My father was diagnosed with aortic valve disease when I was 26 during a routine examination that his primary care physician had been suggesting he schedule for 2 years and that he had been rescheduling for 18 months. The diagnosis was not immediately alarming: moderate stenosis, manageable with monitoring, likely to require intervention within 5 to 8 years. What it required in the shorter term was a care management structure, a cardiologist, quarterly appointments, medication management, coordination between his primary care physician and the specialist, someone to track the imaging results and ensure the follow-up appointments were actually scheduled rather than perpetually rescheduled. My father was not good at this. This was not a character flaw so much as a structural one. He had spent 40 years in a role where other people managed the surrounding logistics so that he could focus on the work. My mother was willing but easily overwhelmed by medical systems. She found the terminology confusing and the portal interfaces impenetrable, and the question of which form needed to go where and by when to be a source of genuine distress. Marcus lived 40 minutes away and had 2 young children and a demanding job and a wife who was, in the kindest possible terms, not oriented toward absorbing additional family logistics. I lived 20 minutes away. I had a background in health services administration. I had spent the first 4 years after my undergraduate degree working for a hospital system in a care coordination role, learning exactly how medical record-keeping worked, how referral processes functioned, how to read a test result, and understand what question it was answering. I had left that role to work independently, consulting for smaller healthcare providers on care coordination systems and patient communication workflows. I understood the landscape my father's diagnosis required navigating, and I was close and I did not have children and my schedule was flexible. So, I managed it. Not as a formal arrangement. Not as something that was asked of me, discussed, compensated, or even explicitly acknowledged. I managed it the way I had learned to be useful in this family, quietly, from a position of invisibility, in a way that produced results without producing attention. I built a shared document for my father's medical information that included his medication list, his appointment history, his imaging results, and the contact information for every provider involved in his care. I set up the appointment reminders. I attended, in person or by phone, the quarterly cardiology appointments, sitting in the corner of the room with a notepad, asking the questions my father had not thought to ask, making sure the answers were recorded. I handled the prior authorization requests when his insurance changed and his medication needed reapproval. I coordinated with the hospital's intake department when, 3 years into the management of his condition, the stenosis progressed to the point where the intervention discussion became concrete. My father did not thank me for any of this in any specific way. My mother said, occasionally, that she didn't know what they would do without me, in the tone of someone noting that the dishwasher was running correctly. Marcus, when the subject of my father's medical management came up in family conversations, tended to redirect toward the larger question of how their father was doing overall, which was a different question, and one I had already answered in the shared document that I was reasonably certain Marcus had never opened. I am not describing this to build a case for my own virtue. I am describing it because it is the context without which the birthday dinner at Sorrel makes no sense, and because the context is the part that tends to be invisible in these stories, the part that gets left out in favor of the dramatic moment, when in fact the dramatic moment only carries weight because of the years that preceded it. The years that preceded it were 11. 11 years of quarterly appointments and medication logs and insurance calls and referral coordination. 11 years of the shared document that tracked every imaging result and every provider note and every prescription change. 11 years of being the infrastructure of my father's medical life, performing that function from a position of structural invisibility, because that was the role the family's physics had assigned me, and I had not yet found the language to renegotiate it. The escalation toward the birthday dinner happened in the way that escalations in family systems usually happen. Not through a single event, but through the accumulation of events that each seemed individually manageable and that collectively constituted something that could no longer be absorbed. In the spring of the year I turned 32, my father's cardiologist at the time, a physician named Dr. Edward Marsh, who had managed his case for 4 years, left his practice to join a research institution in another city. The transition required finding a new cardiologist, transferring records, re-establishing the care relationship, and ensuring continuity of the monitoring protocol during the gap. This was not a crisis, but it was a logistics challenge of the kind that, in my family, fell to me. I researched 3 cardiologists affiliated with the hospital system that held my father's records. I reviewed their backgrounds, their patient volume, their published work on valve disease. I identified Dr. Anita Rourke as the strongest candidate. She was a specialist in structural heart disease with a specific focus on aortic valve intervention. She was affiliated with the hospital my father's records were already in, and her patient reviews consistently mentioned the quality of her communication with patients and families. I scheduled the initial consultation. I prepared a summary of my father's case history, a 12-page document that covered his diagnosis, imaging progression, medication history, and the relevant questions for the new physician to address. I attended the consultation. My father sat in the examination chair and answered Dr. Rourke's questions, and I sat in the corner chair with the document and filled in the details when his account was incomplete, which was frequently. Dr. Rourke was a precise woman in her mid-50s, with the quality of giving her full attention to whoever was speaking in a way that made you aware it was a deliberate professional choice rather than a natural tendency. She reviewed the case summary I had prepared. She asked me at one point whether I was in a healthcare field, and I told her about my background in care coordination. She nodded in the way that people who have dealt with a great many disorganized family medical situations nod when they encounter an organized one. After the consultation, she shook my father's hand and said she was glad to have him as a patient. On the way out, she handed me her direct line card and said that if I had questions between appointments, I should call the number on the back rather than going through the main office. She said it quietly, in the manner of someone who has learned to recognize the person in a family who is actually managing the situation. I thanked her and put the card in my wallet. Over the following 8 months, I built the same coordination structure with Dr. Work's office that I had maintained with Dr. Marsh's. I attended every appointment. I kept the shared document current. When the most recent echocardiogram in September showed a further progression in the stenosis severity from moderate to severe, and Dr. Work sat across from my father and said that she wanted to schedule a surgical consultation for valve replacement within the next 3 months, I was the one who noted the date, confirmed the referral process, and made sure the hospital intake coordinator received the imaging files within the week. I was also the one who, in the conversation with Dr. Work's office coordinator 2 weeks before my birthday, learned that the medical proxy form, the document that would authorize Dr. Work to make certain procedural decisions in my father's best interest during the valve replacement if my father was unable to do so himself, had been prepared by Philip Gaines, my father's estate attorney, and sent to Dr. Work's office for her signature as the supervising physician. The coordinator mentioned it in passing, noting that it had come in and that Dr. Work would be signing it and returning it to Philip's office by the end of the following week. I noted this. I did not think about it consciously in terms of the birthday dinner. I was calling about a different matter, the pre-procedure lab work schedule, and the proxy document came up as a passing administrative detail. I filed it in the same mental category where I kept all of the administrative details of my father's care. Tracked, known, waiting for the next action. I had been managing the details of my father's medical life for 11 years. I had managed them without being asked, without formal acknowledgement, without the specific recognition that might have made the arrangement feel like a partnership rather than an invisible service. And I had accepted this arrangement, in the way that you accept arrangements that are the only arrangements available, until they become habits so established that examining them feels like a kind of disloyalty. My birthday fell on a Thursday in November. I had organized the dinner myself because that was what I did. I organized things, and because the alternative was that it would not be organized or would be organized badly, and I preferred my own birthday to go well. I had chosen Sorrel because I liked it, and because the private room held exactly 12 people, and because the menu was one I knew my father would enjoy, which was a consideration I was still at 32, factoring into the planning of my own celebration. I invited Dr. Work as a professional courtesy. She had become, over 8 months, reliable presence in the management of my father's care, and I thought she might enjoy a dinner outside a clinical context. She accepted. I noted at the time that this was unusual. Physicians do not typically accept social invitations from patients' family members, and understood it as a reflection of the specific professional regard that had developed between us over those 8 months. She came not as my father's doctor, but as something that didn't have a clean name, a professional who had been led into the particular difficulty of this family's situation and who had chosen, for reasons of her own, to extend the relationship beyond the clinical. Marcus called me the morning of my birthday to say he was running late from a work thing and might not make the appetizer course, which was accurate. He arrived during the appetizers, not before them, and to ask whether Dad seemed okay, by which he meant in the general health sense, not in any more specific sense that would have required him to have read the shared document. I told him Dad seemed fine. I was standing in my apartment putting on earrings when he called. I set the phone on the counter and finished the second earring and picked the phone back up and told my brother I would see him at 7. The moment Dr. Work stood up from the table and walked out of the private dining room at Sorrel, the room did something I did not expect. It did not fill with noise. It did not dissolve into the confusion of everyone speaking at once. What it did was contract. The way rooms contract when the person with the most authority in them has removed herself and left the remaining occupants to manage the weight of what's been said without that authority present. My father was still standing. He had said what he had said, and the room had gone quiet, and then Dr. Work had left, and now he was standing at the head of the table with his hands at his sides, and the specific expression of a man who had planned the delivery of something and had not planned what came after. Philip Gaines, seated at the far end of the table, set his wine glass down with a careful, deliberate movement. Philip was 61, a careful man with a long practice in estate law and the particular quality of stillness that lawyers who handle family disputes develop over decades of sitting in rooms where things have gone sideways. He looked at my father. He did not say anything. He looked at him the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you have witnessed what just happened and are making a permanent note of it. My mother's hands, which had been resting in her lap, came up to the edge of the table and gripped it lightly, not dramatically, just the subtle postural shift of someone steadying themselves against a surface. Marcus, to my father's right, had set his drink down during my father's speech and had not picked it up again. He was looking at the tablecloth in the specific manner of a person who is trying to decide what role he is playing in the scene that has just unfolded and has not yet arrived at an answer. Eleanor Vance, one of my oldest friends, who was seated to my left and who had known me since we were both 23 and working in adjacent offices in the same hospital building, had turned to face me with a directness that I registered in my peripheral vision without meeting. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was waiting. I did not speak. I reached for the water glass in front of me and took one sip and set it back precisely in the ring it had left on the tablecloth. I looked at the pendant light above the center of the table, the amber globe, still and warm, and I waited for my father to sit down. He sat down. The silence that followed was about 40 seconds, which is a very long time for a table of 11 people to be completely quiet. I counted it not by looking at a clock, but by the cadence of my own breathing, which I had learned to use as a timing mechanism in difficult rooms. 3 counts in, 4 counts out, each cycle approximately 7 seconds. It was Marcus who spoke first. He said my father's name. Just the name, Dad, in a tone that I had never heard him use before, a tone that was not accusatory and not soft, that was simply the sound of a person acknowledging that something has happened that cannot be taken back. My father looked at him. Marcus looked at me. I met his eyes, briefly, and looked back at the pendant light. My friend Eleanor said, very quietly to no one in particular, "Vera, the lamb here is supposed to be exceptional. Did you order it?" I said I had ordered it. The tension in the room shifted, not dissolved, but rearranged itself around the practical anchor of the question. Conversation restarted in the careful, tentative way that conversation restarts in rooms that have been disrupted, at lower volume, and with more attention to the surfaces of things. Dr. Rourke returned 7 minutes later. She came back to the table, took her seat to my father's left, placed her napkin in her lap, and said to me, across the table, that she hoped she hadn't missed anything important. I said the lamb was on its way. She said that was good. She had been looking forward to it. She picked up her fork. She did not look at my father.
She did not need to.
Whatever had happened in the lobby during those 7 minutes was its own complete event, and it had happened outside the room, and the room did not need to know the details to understand the weight of it. My father ate his dinner. He was quieter than he had been when he stood up to speak, quieter than I had ever seen him at a table with other people. He spoke when spoken to briefly, and he looked at his plate more than he looked at the room. Philip Gaines, at the end of the dinner, caught my eye as the table was clearing and gave me a brief, specific nod, the nod of a professional who has added something to the file he is keeping in his head and wants you to know it. I nodded back. The dinner ended. People collected coats. My friends said the things you say at the end of a birthday dinner that has been complicated by something no one is ready to discuss directly, the warm, abbreviated things. Eleanor hugged me at the door and said she would call me on Saturday, which meant she would call me the next morning, which she did. My father left without speaking to me directly. He left with my mother, who touched my arm briefly on the way out, a gesture so familiar and so insufficient that I could not find it in myself to be either moved by it or indifferent to it. My brother lingered. He stood at the edge of the lobby after our parents had gone through the door, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, something that was trying to be an apology and did not yet know how to complete itself. "I'll call you," he said. "I know," I said.
He left.
I collected my coat and my bag and thanked the restaurant staff and walked out into the November rain, which was still coming down in steady diagonals, the same as when I'd arrived. I want to describe the walk to my car because it is the scene I have returned to most often in the 13 months since that evening. I had parked 3 blocks from the restaurant, in a structure on Halsted, and I walked the 3 blocks in the rain without opening my umbrella, which was in my bag, but which I did not feel the need to retrieve. The rain was cold, and the sidewalk was wet, and the city made its usual sounds around me, and I walked at the pace I always walk, which is slightly faster than most people, because I find that walking at my natural pace is one of the few times when my body and my mind are both simply doing what they do without negotiation. I thought about my father's voice when he said her name on the way out, and what had made it drop and register. I thought about Philip Gaines's nod. I thought about the 7 minutes Dr. Rourke had spent in the lobby, and the medical proxy form sitting and signed on her desk, and what it means for a physician to excuse herself from a birthday dinner to make a call. I did not arrive at conclusions. I walked 3 blocks in the November rain, and got into my car, and drove home. What happened in the weeks and months after the birthday dinner happened in the order that things happen when the structure of a situation is changed, but none of the parties have yet fully mapped the new terrain. Dr. Rourke called me 4 days after the dinner, on a Monday morning, from the direct line number on the card she had given me 8 months earlier. She said she wanted to check in, and then she said something I have thought about many times since, that she had a note in my father's file regarding the proxy documentation, and that she wanted to make sure I was aware that the document required a family discussion before she could proceed with the signature, not a legal requirement. She clarified, but her own professional standard for anything that touched on end-of-life care decisions. She said she had spoken with Philip Gaines on Thursday evening, and that Philip had agreed that a family meeting would be appropriate. She said this, without commentary on the dinner. She said it in her clinical voice, clear and unhurried, in the tone of a physician who has decided what the correct professional path forward is, and is communicating that path to the relevant party. I said I understood. I said I would coordinate the family meeting. She said she knew I would, and she ended the call. The family meeting happened the following Saturday, in the living room of my parent house. Present, my parents, Marcus, Philip Gaines, and me. Dr. Rourke did not attend. She had provided Philip with the framework questions that she needed addressed before she could finalize her signature, and Philip ran the meeting with those questions as the agenda. I am not going to describe the full meeting, because some of what was said in it belongs to the people who said it. What I will tell you is that the meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes, and that during those 2 hours and 11 minutes my father said, in a room with 4 witnesses, several things he had not said before, about the birthday dinner, about the years preceding it, about the specific difficulty he had always had with the fact of me, which he described in terms that were neither an apology nor a justification but which were, for the first time, at least an honest account. My mother said very little. Philip said what he needed to say as the meeting's facilitator. Marcus said at one point, something that surprised me, that he had known for a long time that the arrangement wasn't right, meaning the arrangement where I managed everything and received nothing in the way of formal acknowledgement, and that he had not said so because saying so would have required acknowledging his own participation in it. He said this looking at the carpet. I noted it and did not respond to it directly because the meeting was not the moment for that conversation, and I had learned to distinguish between the moments that require a response and the ones that require only witnessing. After the meeting, Philip stayed behind briefly. He said, in the direct manner of a man who has spent 3 decades in estate law and no longer sees the point in indirection, that my father's estate documents were due for a review, and that he wanted me to know that I was welcome to have my own legal representation before any discussions about those documents took place. He said it without elaborating. I said I understood. He said he thought I did, and he collected his briefcase and left. I called Sandra Osei, an estate and family law attorney who had been recommended to me by a colleague 2 years earlier, and whose name I had kept in my phone without specific occasion to use it. The following Tuesday. We met for an initial consultation the week after. I will not describe the details of what followed over the next 4 months, partly because some of it is confidential and partly because the legal process was the frame around the story rather than the story itself. What I will say is that by the time my father's valve replacement procedure was scheduled for the following April, the estate documents had been reviewed by both Sandra and Philip, a revised arrangement had been formalized, and Dr. Rourke had signed the medical proxy. The procedure went well. My father was in the hospital for 4 days and in cardiac rehabilitation for 8 weeks, and during both periods I continued to manage his care coordination in the way I had been managing it for 11 years, with the same shared document and the same follow-up calls and the same attendance at the appointments that mattered. The difference was that I was doing it under a formal arrangement that had been documented by 2 attorneys and that included, for the first time, an explicit acknowledgement, in writing by my father, of what I had been contributing and for how long. This did not feel like victory. It felt like accuracy. Like the ledger had finally been corrected to reflect what had actually been happening, which is a different thing from winning, and a more useful one. It has been 13 months since the birthday dinner at Sorrel. My father and I speak once a week. The conversations are different from the conversations we had before, shorter in some ways and longer in others, more precise in the ways that matter, and less concerned with the surfaces that don't. He is in good health by the measures available to us. The valve is functioning as Dr. Rourke expected. The rehabilitation went as planned. His energy has returned to something close to what it was before the stenosis progressed to the point where it was limiting him, without either of us quite naming that it was. He has not apologized in the specific constructed way that the word apology usually refers to. What he has done is say, in various conversations across these 13 months, things that amount to the same reckoning without the formal structure. He said once, about 8 months after the procedure, that he had not understood, or had not allowed himself to understand, how much of the last 11 years I had been carrying. He said it the way people say things they have been working toward for a long time and have finally found the words for, without drama, without elaboration, in the tone of a factual statement being added to a record that has been incomplete until now. I said it was manageable, which was true, though not complete. Marcus and I have a different relationship than we had before the birthday dinner, not warmer exactly but more honest, which I have come to understand is the more durable improvement. He calls me now when he has questions about our parents rather than asking our mother and assuming the information will reach me eventually. It is a small shift in the structure of communication, and it has made a measurable difference in how the system functions. I notice it in the same way I notice when a process improvement actually works, without fanfare, with satisfaction. Dr. Rourke sent me a note after my father's 3-month post-operative review, saying that his numbers looked excellent and that the care coordination file I maintained was the most organized she had encountered in her practice. She said it was a genuine clinical advantage. I said I was glad it was useful. We shook hands in the hospital corridor, and she went back to her other patients, and I went to the parking structure and drove home and made dinner. Sandra Osei and I have stayed in contact. She referred me to a colleague who needed help thinking through the care coordination protocols for her own elderly parents, and I spent an afternoon on the phone walking her through the system I had built for my father, the shared document structure, the appointment tracking, the provider communication log. The colleague said she wished someone had told her about this years ago. I said most people didn't know to set it up until they needed it, and by then the urgency made it harder. She asked if I had ever thought about formalizing it as a service. I said I had been thinking about it.
I have been thinking about it.
I consult independently on healthcare coordination systems for small providers, and I have been considering whether what I built for my father, a structured, documented care management system for complex patients managed by family caregivers, is something that could be made into a formal offering. I have not decided yet. I am thinking carefully, in the way I think about things that matter, which is to say slowly, with attention to what the structure will actually bear. There is something I want to say about the pendant light at Sorrel, the amber globe above the center of the long walnut table, because I have been thinking about it since that November evening. When my father said what he said, I looked at that light. I did not look at him, not after the first moment of receiving what he was transmitting. I looked at the light because I needed something fixed and warm in my field of vision, something that was exactly what it appeared to be and would not change its nature while I was looking at it. I have thought about why that worked. Why fixing my eyes on a steady object in a room where something destabilizing has just happened is useful, and the answer I have arrived at is simple, because it gave me somewhere to direct the attention that would otherwise have gone somewhere less useful. Not to my father's face. Not to the expressions of the people around the table. To something still and steady and warm that required nothing of me except to be looked at. What I have come to understand, in 13 months of examining what happened in that room, is that the steadiness I found in that light was not the light's quality. It was mine. The light was just the surface I used to access it. I had been building that steadiness for 32 years without knowing that was what I was building, out of the quiet management and the invisible work and the discipline of showing up for things I hadn't been asked to show up for, and doing them well even when doing them well went unrecorded. The record does not have to be visible to be real. The work does not have to be witnessed to have happened. But there is a point at which the absence of witness becomes its own kind of problem, Not because you need the recognition, but because you have accepted an arrangement that misrepresents the truth of what is happening, and the misrepresentation costs you more over time than honesty would have cost either party at the beginning. What I would say to someone who has been managing the invisible work, the appointments, the paperwork, the coordination, the steady, unsexy labor of keeping something functioning that other people rely on without noticing, is this: the work is real. The record you keep of it is real. And the moment you stop accepting a misrepresentation of that reality is not a betrayal of the people who benefited from your quiet management. It is a correction. Corrections are not cruelties. They are the truth, becoming legible at last. 12 people were at the table at Sorrel on a November evening when my father stood up and said what he said. 12 people watched Dr. Anita Rourke fold her hands and excuse herself to make a call. I did not arrange that. I did not plan it. I booked the restaurant and confirmed the dietary requirements and chose a pendant light I liked above the table, and I set my water glass down carefully when I needed to, and I waited. The waiting was not passivity. It was the specific action of someone who had done the work and kept the record and knew what the record showed. You do not have to perform your own defense when the documentation already exists. You just have to stay in the room. If something in this story reflected something you have lived through, the invisible work, the birthday that went sideways, the moment when the room finally heard something true, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you're new here, subscribe. There is more where this came from. Take care of yourselves.